Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
They were building positions in there
if
for a
anything happened
fight.
to us, by the time anyone got to us,
I think it was
the
chaos.
weather was so bad there would be
I
no
used to
body
run
left.
with boots full of blood.
And the next thing I hear was alarms,
Chances of
screaming.
survival were very, very slim.
The soldiers didn't want to go into the ambushes, so they'd send the kids in first. And so he was sent in first into an ambush and he got shot in the stomach.
It was very hard for me, very hard for my family.
And the plane burst into
Proud of the
flames.
crew, proud of what I've achieved and what I'm
To
doing.
volunteer for service was in effect to put your life on the line.
Today on Life on the Line, I spoke with Dr Karl James, Senior Historian at the Australian War Memorial. On Anzac Day 2017, Karl gave a speech about the enduring resonance of Gallipoli and Kokoda to the Australian public. With Anzac Day around the corner this year, it felt like the perfect time to talk with Karl about these pillars of Australian military history. I'm Alex Lloyd, and I'm at the Australian War Memorial speaking with Dr Karl James. It's your second appearance on Life on the Line, Karl, so welcome back to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me, Alex. You guys have done an amazing job with the podcast, and it's been really exciting to listen to.
Thanks, Karl. Gallipoli and Kokoda are so intimately associated with the Australian national character. Focusing on Gallipoli for the moment, what was it about the troops on the shore that fateful morning that would lead to them becoming, in a sense, the definition of our Australian values?
I think in many ways it's the first big test. It's described as the first great test of Australian manhood. It's the first time Australian forces deploy on a major military operation. And you have this sense, it's very old-fashioned today by today's standards, but this notion that a nation needed to be blooded, it needed to test itself in battle and in combat. Now, what we would now call Australians, certainly people who lived in Australia, have been fighting in all of the Empire's wars, it certainly seems. We know people from the colonies went and served in the British Army and fought at Waterloo. We also know that Waterloo veterans came to Australia. From the 1860s, people in the colonies went to fight in New Zealand during the Maori Wars, and later on once we formed colonial units, the Boer War, the Boxer Rebellion, the Boer War. So we do have a sense of sending our men overseas to fight, whether or not they themselves would have identified as being Australian in the 1890s or 1899 or around 1900. Kind of questionable, I think, a little bit arguable. But anyway, so soldiers have left Australian shores to fight to overseas. But with the First World War, and especially with Gallipoli, this is our first major test. Big battle, big operation, and more Australians are killed on those first couple of days at the landing at Anzac than had been killed in all of our previous colonial conflicts. So it was the scale, the scope, the sense too of an element of excitement. So the press reports when they did filter back to Australia of this landing at this place called Gallipoli, which no one had ever heard of beforehand, was quite exciting. And you had things such as Ashmead Bartlett's famous dispatches where he talks about this race of athletes scaling the shores and men going ahead under fire. So all those values of bravery, mateship, courage, endurance, it was the values that were really talked up, what Australians were displaying on the battlefield at Gallipoli, on the peninsula. And it's those qualities which I think we all like to think about ourselves. And so that's part of the basis for it too. And I think as the war went on and we moved to the Western Front, and keep in mind too that more casualties at Fromelles in one night on the Western Front than the entire 8 months at Gallipoli. The Western Front is this huge mincemeat in many ways of modern warfare. It just is devastating. After the war, the nation emerges, very much the sort of grief and mourning. There were 2 plebiscites to do with conscription for overseas service, incredibly divisive on the Australian home front, very much fought along sectarian lines, so Catholics versus Protestants, as well as class too, as middle class versus the working class, so incredibly divisive. The country is a nation in mourning. And you think, well, what was the cost? What was the point of it? Well, the last thing that was legacy was this sense of Australianness, Australian values. We were tested, we were found not to be wanting, and in fact on the battlefield, particularly during 1917 and 1918, the AIF performed outstandingly well. So I think that's part of the bedrock or the basis for our what we would now look back on as part of that Australian values. And also too, it's changed over time. So it was quite an important part of the Australian story post First World War, but then it's not really picked up again from mass way until about the 1980s. So you have this looking back and a sense of nostalgia as well, I suspect.
Coming back to British war correspondent Ellis Ashmead Bartlett, he had quite a romanticised account of Australians on the shore that morning and didn't exactly match up with the writings of Charles Bean, you could say. Why do you think he described Australians that way in his initial reporting?
Well, his dispatch wasn't really for Australian consumption. He was writing sort of quite famously now. He wasn't on the front line. I mean, they weren't able to send war correspondents, weren't able to land or be embedded, the way we would now describe them. And he was really writing for home, writing for the British public to support them, to say, look, our colonials are as good as the British soldiers, and an element of a good news story too. And I think as the campaign went on, Ashmead Bartlett, as well as Charles Bean, a cynicism that grows within the dispatches. In many ways, Bean was always more of a historian than a journalist. So Bean was appointed as our first official war correspondent, but his dispatches are actually pretty bland. They don't have a lot of colour, and he was very much driven by the facts, and that's why he had problems with censorship, and also too why his reports weren't as widely picked up or circulated, because he wrote bland copy, whereas Ellis Ashmead Bartlett just has such colour that comes from his pen. It's much easier to read. But anyway, as the campaign goes on and it evolves, the casualties mount, there's frustration, there's a lack of progress, the rations, for example, the poor rations set in, the miserable conditions, there's that sense of frustration or pointlessness. What are we achieving? Men are dying for what? It's not helping win the war any faster. The strategy of trying to clear the Dardanelles to get through to Constantinople clearly isn't working, and so at what point, but yet it seemed to be just reinforcing failure, particularly after York's defensive. So we have things such as Lone Pine the Neck and the landing at Cape Helles. When the objectives aren't achieved, why are we still here, or why are they still there?
And I think the colourful account, it gripped the nation when it was first reported. Going forward to our national psyche today, how much do you think that has impacted on our national values now, as opposed to how it was initially welcomed at the time?
It's an interesting question. I think a lot depends on who you ask. Australia of 1915 is incredibly different to Australia of 2018 in terms of our values, our attributes, our sense of identity. I think there is that sense of nostalgia of looking back, of how we like to see ourselves. There's that myth of us always punching above our weight, which is a myth. But it's the same type of language you see our national sporting teams describe in cricket, rugby union, rugby league. It's just really, I think, an imagined way for us to look back and how we see ourselves. And yeah, they do pick out those good values, particularly a sense of mateship and sacrifice. But also this view that we're egalitarian, that we're all mates, and it's more the way to define us against the British, particularly in that context of 1915 and post-First World War. There is something uniquely distinctive about Australian, despite the fact that most people were of British ancestry. About a third of the first RAF was actually born in Britain. We have the same language, the same values, largely the same religion. It was a sense for us to bring out and to play up our difference, which is why I think it really made a big comeback into the 80s and also in the 1990s when you have that Republican debate. And this is really where Kokoda becomes much more part of the story, because it's that sense of an Australianness as opposed to sort of shared British Australian values. Gallipoli and then also Kokoda have a much stronger sense of Australianness to distinguish ourselves from our allies and really our family.
I'd always pick Lone Pine as an example of us punching above our weight. Why is that a myth?
Well, basically because...
in a broader sense as well as Lone Pine, I mean.
It's just how we like to talk about ourselves and punching above our weight, whereas really we deploy a force that is arranged in a normal British conventional force, part of the British Army. On Gallipoli, Australian officers are as good as killing our men as British soldiers are. So in the movie, in Peter Weir's Gallipoli, for example, there's a British officer who basically orders a charge to go ahead. In reality, that was an Australian officer. So we just sort of playing to the stereotypes. And I think we always do like to say, hey, we punch above our weight. But that's mainly because we tend to deploy, post-Second World War, we've always tended to deploy small forces. So in Vietnam, it was a task force of 2 battalions and later on 3 battalions. And even in Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly in Afghanistan, while we are the 3rd largest force beyond Britain and the United States, we're still only talking about hundreds of men, or hundreds of soldiers, men and women, I should say. We're not a major player.
In 1916, the Anzacs moved from Gallipoli to France, and their actions on the Western Front and the casualties dwarf anything that happened on Turkish shores. But Gallipoli is still at the core of our national narrative, not the Western Front. Why do you think that is?
I think Gallipoli is an easier story. A range of different reasons answering that question. Gallipoli itself, you have the physicality of the peninsula. You can go there today. It's accessible. So you can visit Anzac Cove and North Beach. You can look up and see the Sphinx. The terrain roughly still looks the same. So it's that physicality. You can imagine what it would be like to climb up those cliffs and to sit in the trenches at Lone Pine. Go to the neck, and at Lone Pine you can sort of look across the cemetery and think, okay, this is the vista of the battlefield. The cemetery itself is pretty much represents the Turkish lines and the Australian lines. So you have the physicality of the campaign. Gallipoli is a simple story to understand as well. We arrive on the 25th of April. There's a big Turkish counterattack in May. It's killed a lot of casualties. You have the August offensive, doesn't go anywhere, and then by the end of the year we pull back. Once you move into the Western Front, the rationale becomes much harder to understand. What is the different phases from the Third Battle of Ypres, for example, in October, or September, October 1917? Because you have Passchendaele, Brunswick Ridge, it just becomes, the story is much more confused. And rather than Gallipoli, where basically all these strains are together, on the Western Front, you have different divisions rotating in at different times. They're part of different larger formations. So you don't always get the same sort of commonality of experience in terms of battles, although the experience of being bombed and shelled and blown up and gassed is somewhat universal. So I think it's the advantage to Gallipoli. It's the physicality of the campaign. It's the first. Again, keep in mind, that's why it's attractive, because it's the first major event of the war, and it's an easier story. Everything has a place name in Gallipoli. You know, every plateau, every knoll, every corner, you can name it, identify it, you can link it back to a person. Once you get into the vastness of the Western Front, you lose that sense of, it's no longer intimate. You know, the battlefield itself goes for hundreds of kilometres at times, massive fronts during the Third Battle of Ypres and the Battle of Somme. And the sense of the individual is lost, I think, in that mass conflict.
The Anzac legend continues a generation later. Japan enters World War II on 7 December 1941 and advanced rapidly towards Australia in 1942. But before we get to Kokoda, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, were the Japanese actually planning on invading Australia?
No, what we now know is the Japanese had no concrete plans to invade mainland Australia. Certainly in those first few months of 1942, our darkest year, the Japanese smashed through Southeast Asia and the Pacific. So they captured Rabaul in January. So Rabaul, part of Australia's mandated territory. Singapore falls in February. The Netherlands East Indies, so modern-day Indonesia, collapses during February and March. And then there too, only 4 days after the fall of Singapore, so on the 19th, Darwin is bombed for the first time. So within about 6 weeks, 6 or 2.5 months, the Japanese have gone from Japan all the way down to Australian shores. So understandably, there's a lot of fear, concern, a little bit of paranoia, worrying about where will the Japanese stop. And the Japanese there was a plan from elements within the Japanese army of looking towards invading mainland Australia or making an attack on mainland Australia. The Japanese Navy, though, really knocked that out very quickly. From the Japanese Navy's point of view, they realised they didn't have enough ships to supply an invasion force or to maintain an invasion force. It's one thing to get troops to a foreign shore, but you still need to supply them. And the bulk of the Japanese army was always deployed in China anyway. So it was floated briefly during that phase of, they call it victory disease, when the Japanese themselves surprised at their own success. But it was ruled out very, very quickly. So while Australian territory was occupied, so New Guinea as well as Papua, there was never any concrete plans to invade mainland Australia.
It's an understandable fear and concern at the time, though, and that does bring us to another key pillar of Australian history and our national character, Kokoda. Why do you think Kokoda has this enduring resonance?
Again, like Gallipoli, it's the physicality. People have heard of the Owen Stanley Range. You can go there today. You can walk the Kokoda Trail or the Kokoda Track, depending on your preference. It's easy to do. You have incredibly powerful visual images from the film Kokoda Front Line. So you see the men in the rain, in the mud, trying to push through the mountainous terrain. It is a simple narrative, much like Gallipoli. The Japanese land on the north coast of Papua in late July, move across the Owen Stanley Range. By mid-September, they're forced to fall back. And then so the second half is us pushing the Japanese back across the mountains. Pretty simple narrative, physicality of the terrain, the powerful visual images, and again too, the idea of courage, endurance, mateship, sacrifice, those values that are inscribed in the Memorial of Disarava have become so closely connected with Australian values, it gives a greater meaning to it. And also keep in mind too, it's a very, very strong Australian story. You have Australian soldiers fighting on Australian territory fighting to stop the Japanese, which the soldiers thought may be invading the Australian mainland. So if you don't stop the Japanese at Kokoda or Sarava or Brigade Hill or Port Moresby, then we're going to stop the Japanese. So it's Kokoda is incredibly strong with that sense of Australianness. And unusually too, it's one of those only times when Australian soldiers are fighting the Japanese, so the Americans don't take part in the battle, and the higher conduct of the campaign is being run by Australian commanders. So we have that neat little Australian story. Australian soldiers on Australian territory, under Australian command, fighting just by themselves against the Japanese invader.
That's a bit of a contrast to Gallipoli, where it was more international effort.
Oh, absolutely. And this is why Kokoda has had a longer resonance than, say, Tobruk or even El Alamein, which were probably more decisive battles in the scheme of the war, certainly in their respective theatres. I mean, Kokoda is a fringe of a fringe campaign in many ways in the Pacific, where the war in the Pacific would be decisive, turned out to be in the Central Pacific with the US Navy and US Marines. El Alamein is a huge turning point in the war in 1942, but they're the Australian 9th Division as part of a much larger coalition force. So there's New Zealand Division, Rhodesian South Africans, as well as the British Army. So the Australian part of the story is much harder to pull out. Whereas at Kokoda, it's pretty much just us. And likewise at Gallipoli, so it is a coalition force, but the Australian element is stronger.
And how did that fighting at Kokoda compare to the Solomon Islands, Borneo, Philippines?
It really varies over time. So in many ways, particularly during the early part of the campaigns, Maroubra Force, so the 39th Battalion and then later on 21 Brigade, vicious at times, quite vicious hand-to-hand fighting. The Australian soldiers don't have heavy weapons, so they didn't bring up their mortars or their medium machine guns. It's really just your 303 rifle, your bayonet, your entrenching tool, your helmet, and then your light machine gun, such as your Tommy gun. That's pretty much about it. In the latter part of the war, the soldiers deploy with their heavy weapons. So you have, and so battalion level heavy weapons, so your 2 and your 3-inch mortars, your Vickers medium machine gun, plus all the other assets such as artillery, tanks, aircraft, airstrikes, all those other tools of modern warfare that you would see and recognise. So, for example, Kokoda is incredibly different to the fighting at, say, Borneo in 1945, for example, during the Oboe operations, where the Allies have overwhelming air and sea firepower and just annihilate the Japanese in the invasion beaches of Balikpapan, whereas at Kokoda, 2.5 years earlier, we were really just scrounging and just fighting with our bare hands at times, particularly at places such as Sarava.
What are the parallels you see between Gallipoli and Kokoda then?
I think in many ways what has endured has become that sense of Australian values, the shared values, the universal experience of men sticking together with their mates, of them hanging out, enduring amongst the conditions. So despite Kokoda, it's wet all the time, it rains all the time, there's very little food, not a lot of variety in their dietary needs, they're sick, they're run down, they're exhausted physically and mentally. Even if you're not fighting the Japanese actively in battles, there's constant patrolling, and while you may not have a contact, if you're out sort of beyond the wire, the Japanese could be around the bend at any turn. Like, you don't know, it's dark, you can't see in front of you. That constant stress plays on your mind. Take it back 25 years earlier to Gallipoli. Again, they're on the peninsula, it's hot, the food is incredibly poor, sickness and disease run rampant. Yet despite that, the Australians at Gallipoli, they're hanging on. They haven't given up, they're exhausted, they're fatigued, but they're still hanging in there. So there's those values, which I think are universal, almost a commonality of misery, despite the physical conditions. They're still, at Gallipoli, they're being bombed and shelled constantly. Everywhere within the Gallipoli Peninsula came under Turkish sort of fire. There was no safe places, a little bit like in the jungle, because if you get lost and if you're off the track, you're there by yourself. So there's the constant sort of threat and constant menace. So it's the physicality is similar, but more so I think it is the values that have proved to be enduring, and that strong sense of an Australian, recognisably Australian sense of self that I think we couldn't all aspire to, which is why Gallipoli and Kokoda have both endured.
The romanticism and tragedy of the narratives and the Australianness of them, it's why they resonate still with us today.
Both of them are great stories. At the end of the day, even if you take out the nationalism or the patriotism, they're cracking yarns of guys who are just sent there and they're doing their best and they hang on. And through that adversity, they kind of establish something that's bigger than themselves.
And Karl, you've written a book on this topic too, Kokoda, Beyond the Legend.
Oh, thank you for the plug. Yes, we do. So this is Kokoda. It's an edited volume, and it really looks about putting the story of Kokoda and the Papuan campaigns in 1942 into a much larger perspective. Now, while I've said Kokoda is a cracking yarn, and it certainly is, there's been lots of books about Kokoda, but often it's about individual soldiers, or it's about people talking about the same types of things. There's not a lot of new sort of discoveries. And what we did with Kokoda Beyond the Legend, it was to put... Oh, the other thing too, it's really easy to be parochial. While I'm talking about Australian values today, we can't always just talk about Australian stories to Australians all the time. We need to put ourselves into a wider context, because I think then we get a greater understanding and a greater appreciation of why are we fighting at Kokoda? Okay, what is the importance? What's the Japanese experience? What are the Japanese soldiers doing? How did we get to Kokoda? What are the Americans doing? We can't just keep telling the same types of stories to ourselves all of the time. So with Kokoda Beyond the Legend, I have together a team of authors really to put Kokoda into that wider context of the war in 1942. So we also have a contribution from Sir Anthony Beevor. He's talking about the big picture of the war in 1942. Richard Frank, who's an American historian he's pretty much the expert on Guadalcanal, because Guadalcanal and Kokoda are actually connected in parallel. So from the Japanese, they're based in Rabaul. During one axis, they're looking towards Port Moresby across the Island Stanleys, and then another axis of the Japanese advance is looking down the Solomon Island chain to Guadalcanal. Both of them are important from the Japanese perspective, but we only ever talk about Kokoda. We don't really engage the debate with Guadalcanal. The reason they're connected is because the Japanese take their reverses of Guadalcanal in August. It's because the Japanese are losing at Guadalcanal and they think that Guadalcanal and Solomons are more important. They then order the commander on the ground at Kokoda, General Horry, to fall back. So we don't actually push the Japanese back across the Island Stanleys. Horry is ordered to withdraw because of the reverses at Guadalcanal, and the Australians then pursue Horry and the South Seas Force back across the mountains. That connection between Kokoda and Guadalcanal is often lost. So we wanted in this volume to bring that together, as well as really look at the Japanese much more and delve much deeper into the Japanese story. So we have chapters looking at the command structure within the Japanese hierarchy of Horry's relationship with his battalion and regimental commanders, because they were as fractured as the Australian commanders were, and also just get a better sense of who are the Japanese soldiers, like who were the men from the 144th Regiment, what was their prefecture they came from, what was their training. You know, they've been called up, basically it's a farming society, and they're called up in the 1930s, in early 1940s to become soldiers. They're not the elite, which people often describe them. They're conscripted soldiers, but they just had a little bit more combat experience than the Australians. Well, some of the Australians, mainly the 39th Battalion. So it's really timely to look at this battle, which everyone knows the name of Kokoda, but to look at it in more detail and to put it into that bigger part of the story, into a global context.
Well, Karl, I'm happy to plug it because it sounds like a great read.
Cracking read.
You've given us a lot to think about in terms of our Australian character and values and how we fit our own history into our own sense of self, with Anzac Day right around the corner. Thanks for your time today. That was my conversation with Dr. Karl James on the enduring resonance of Gallipoli and Kokoda. Thomas Kay interviewed Karl last year in Season 1 on the history of Australia's Special Forces, so do check that episode out if you missed it. Karl also participated in our World War II documentary, For School and Country. Find out more about that at forschoolandcountry.com. Life on the Line will be keeping busy this Anzac Day. Follow our adventures on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Life on the Line Podcast and on Twitter at LOTL Pod. Our website is www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com, and you can email us at podcast@lifeonthelinepodcast.com. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions. Artwork by Big Cat Design, music by Dan Van Werkhoven. Thanks for listening, and lest we forget,